1850, a city transformed. Chapter 1. The physical landscape of mid-century Paris. Paris, in 1850, stood at a pivotal moment in its long history, a medieval city bursting at its seams, teetering on the edge of modernity, yet still deeply rooted in centuries of accumulated grime, chaos, and architectural disorder. The city that greeted residents and visitors alike was a far cry from the grand boulevards and elegant monuments we associate with the French capital today. The Paris of 1850 was fundamentally a medieval city, its streets following the same winding, illogical patterns they had traced for hundreds of years. Most thoroughfares were narrow, some barely wide enough for two carts to pass, creating perpetual traffic jams of horses, carriages, pedestrians, and street vendors. These streets, largely unpaved or covered with rough cobblestones, became rivers of mud when it rained and clouds of dust in dry weather. The Seine River cut through the city's heart, but unlike today, it was lined with ramshackle buildings, workshops, laundries, and tanneries that dumped their waste directly into the water. The city's boundaries were still defined by the Wall of the Farmers General, a tax barrier constructed in the late 18th century. This wall enclosed an area much smaller than modern Paris, creating a dense urban core where approximately 1 million people lived in conditions that ranged from merely cramped to utterly squalid. Beyond these walls lay small villages and suburbs that would later be incorporated into the expanding metropolis, but in 1850, Paris proper remained a tightly packed urban island. Buildings in most neighborhoods rose 5 or 6 stories high, their upper floors jutting out over the streets below, blocking sunlight and creating perpetual twilight in the narrow passages. These structures were hodgepodges of different eras and styles, many dating back centuries, their facades crumbling and blackened by soot from thousands of coal fires. Ground floors typically housed shops, workshops, or cafes, while the upper floors contained apartments that decreased in quality and prestige with each ascending staircase. The wealthiest inhabitants occupied the second floor, the noble floor, with its high ceilings and ornate details, while the poorest families crowded into tiny garrets under the eaves, where summer heat was unbearable and winter cold penetrated through every crack. The right bank, north of the Seine, contained most of the commercial activity and a mixture of wealthy and working-class neighborhoods. The Marais, once fashionable, had declined into a district of small manufacturers and artisans. The areas around the Palais Royal and the boulevards maintained some elegance, home to theaters, cafes, and fashionable shops. Further north and east, working-class neighborhoods like Belleville and Ménilmontant sprawled in disorder, their populations swelling with provincial migrants seeking work in the capital. The left bank retained its character as the intellectual and bohemian quarter. The Latin quarter, clustered around the Sorbonne, housed students, writers, and artists in cheap lodgings. The Faubourg Saint-Germain remained the aristocratic quarter, though many noble families had lost their wealth and influence in the turbulent decades since the Revolution. The area around the Luxembourg Gardens provided one of the few green spaces in an otherwise stone-covered city. At the city's heart, the Ile de la Cité remained the historic core, dominated by Notre Dame Cathedral, but also crowded with a dense warren of medieval buildings, many in dangerous states of decay. This island in the Seine would soon face radical transformation, but in 1850, it still represented Paris at its most ancient and most squalid. Public spaces were few and poorly maintained. The Tuileries Gardens and the Luxembourg Gardens offered respite, but most Parisians had no access to parks or open spaces. The city lacked the grand public squares and monuments that would later define it. The Place de la Concorde existed, but the Arc de Triomphe stood isolated at the end of the Champs-Élysées, which was not yet the grand avenue it would become. The Seine itself was both lifeline and sewer. Washerwomen worked along its banks, cargo boats unloaded goods at numerous small ports, and bridges connected the city's sections. However, the river also received the city's waste, creating health hazards and contributing to periodic cholera epidemics that devastated the population. Chapter 2. Daily Life and Social Structures. The social fabric of Paris in 1850 was extraordinarily complex, a rigid hierarchy that nonetheless permitted some social mobility, particularly for those willing to work ruthlessly toward wealth and status. At the apex stood the old aristocracy, Diminished in power since the revolution, but still clinging to prestige and social influence. Many aristocratic families had lost their fortunes and lived in genteel poverty in their crumbling mansions, sustained by pride in their lineage and contempt for the newly wealthy bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie, the rising middle class, had become the dominant force in Parisian society by 1850. This diverse group ranged from wealthy bankers and industrialists to modest shopkeepers and minor government functionaries. The upper bourgeoisie mimicked aristocratic manners while simultaneously mocking aristocratic pretensions, creating their own culture of consumption and display. They lived in comfortable apartments, employed servants, and spent their evenings at the theater or opera. Their wives and daughters devoted themselves to elaborate social rituals, afternoon visits, and the endless pursuit of fashion. Below the bourgeoisie existed a vast working class that constituted the majority of Paris's population. These workers included skilled artisans, tailors, shoemakers, cabinet makers, printers, who took pride in their craft and often owned their own small workshops. They lived modestly, but respectably, their social status far above that of common laborers. Many belonged to mutual aid societies and maintained traditions of worker solidarity that would soon express themselves in political upheaval. Unskilled laborers formed the bottom tier of the working population. These men and women performed back-breaking work for minimal wages, hauling cargo, digging ditches, carrying water, sweeping streets. They lived in the most wretched conditions, often in furnished rooms rented by the week, or even by the night, with multiple families sharing single rooms. Their existence was precarious, with unemployment, illness, or injury spelling immediate catastrophe. A typical working-class day began before dawn. Workers rose in unheated rooms, dressed in layers against the cold, and ate meager breakfasts of bread and coffee, a substitute made from chicory. Skilled workers walked to their workshops, while laborers gathered at designated spots, hoping to be hired for the day. Work continued for 12 to 14 hours, with a brief break for a midday meal, usually bread, cheese, and cheap wine. Evenings offered little leisure, workers were exhausted, and their cramped lodgings provided no comfort. Many men spent their few spare hours in wine shops or cafes, where they could sit in relative warmth and discuss politics, work, and sports. For the bourgeoisie, daily life followed different rhythms. Men departed for their offices, banks, or businesses in mid-morning, often stopping at cafes to read newspapers and conduct informal business. They returned home for elaborate midday dinners with their families, then went back to work until early evening. Bourgeois women rarely worked outside the home. They supervised servants, managed households, paid social calls, and devoted considerable time to their appearance and their daughters' marriage prospects. Domestic servants formed a distinct category in Parisian society. Nearly every bourgeois household employed at least one servant, while wealthy families maintained large staffs. These servants, mostly young women from rural areas, worked grueling hours for low wages, sleeping in tiny rooms under the eaves. They occupied an ambiguous social position, living intimately with their employers yet treated as social inferiors. Many young women entered domestic service, hoping to save enough for a dowry, though the reality often involved exploitation and disappointment. Children's lives varied dramatically by class. Bourgeois children attended school, learned music and languages, and were dressed as miniature adults. They lived in nurseries supervised by nurses or governesses, seeing their parents primarily at designated hours. Working-class children often worked from an early age, either in their parents' workshops or in factories. Formal education was sporadic and minimal for most children of the poor, though church schools and charitable institutions provided some basic instruction. Food culture reflected class divisions. The wealthy enjoyed elaborate multi-course meals with expensive ingredients, fresh meat, game, fine wines, imported delicacies. The middle class ate well, but more modestly, roasted meats, vegetables, bread, ordinary wine. For the working poor, diet was monotonous and minimal. Bread formed the staple, supplemented with cheap vegetables, occasional cheap cuts of meat, and wine diluted with water. Malnutrition was common among the poorest Parisians, contributing to widespread health problems. Social interactions were governed by elaborate codes of behavior. Bourgeois society required formal introductions, calling cards, specific protocols for visits and invitations. Men and women of respectable classes could not speak without proper introduction. Young women required chaperones in public. These rules created a complex social dance that reinforced class distinctions and limited spontaneous interaction. Chapter 3: Political Climate and Revolutionary Tensions. Paris in 1850 existed in the uneasy aftermath of the Revolution of 1848, a tumultuous period that had overthrown King Louis-Philippe, established the Second Republic, witnessed worker uprisings and brutal repression, and ultimately led to the election of Louis-Napoleon Bonaparte as president. The political atmosphere was charged with tension, suspicion, and competing visions of France's future. The Revolution of 1848 had begun in February with protests over electoral reform that quickly escalated into street fighting. Barricades appeared throughout Paris as workers, students, and disaffected bourgeoisie united against the monarchy. Louis-Philippe abdicated and fled to England, and a provisional government proclaimed the Second Republic. For a brief moment, radical reformers dreamed of social transformation, the right to work, universal male suffrage, workers' cooperatives, and genuine democracy. These dreams quickly soured. Elections brought conservatives to power, and when workers staged another uprising in June 1848, demanding social reforms and jobs, the government responded with overwhelming force. General Louis-Eugène Cavaignac led troops who killed thousands of workers in brutal street fighting. The June Days, as this uprising became known, created deep divisions in French society. Workers felt betrayed by the bourgeois republic they had helped create, while property owners and middle-class citizens feared working-class revolution and demanded order. By 1850, Louis-Napoleon Bonaparte had maneuvered himself into a position of dominance. Elected president in December 1848 with overwhelming support, he won over 5 million votes against less than 2 million for his nearest competitor. Louis Napoleon was the nephew of Napoleon I and had campaigned on his famous name. Vague promises of order and prosperity, and appeals to both conservative fears and popular nostalgia for imperial glory. The Constitution of the Second Republic limited presidents to a single 4-year term and prohibited immediate re-election. By 1850, it was clear to astute observers that Louis Napoleon would not peacefully relinquish power when his term ended in 1852. He was already maneuvering, building support among the army, the church, and conservative rural voters, while simultaneously appealing to workers and the urban poor with promises of prosperity and employment. The National Assembly, dominated by conservatives and monarchists who themselves had little love for Republican government, found itself in an awkward position. Many representatives despised Louis Napoleon, but feared popular democracy even more. They passed increasingly restrictive laws aimed at limiting working-class political participation, including a law that effectively disenfranchised 3 million voters by imposing residency requirements that excluded transient workers and the urban poor. Political clubs and newspapers proliferated despite government restrictions. Republican, socialist, and Bonapartist publications competed for readers, though censorship limited what could be printed. Cafes served as informal political forums where men debated the issues of the day. The government employed an extensive network of police spies who infiltrated political organizations and reported on suspicious conversations. Political ideology. In 1850, Paris divided roughly into several camps. Legitimists supported the Bourbon monarchy and dreamed of restoring the old order. Orleanists wanted a constitutional monarchy, similar to that of Louis-Philippe. Republicans believed in democratic government and individual liberty, but disagreed among themselves about social and economic reform. Socialists advocated various schemes for reorganizing society and the economy, ranging from moderate reformism to revolutionary communism. Bonapartists supported Louis Napoleon and his promises of order, prosperity, and national glory. The working class, radicalized by recent experience, inclined toward socialism and republicanism. Many workers had joined secret societies and sworn oaths to defend the republic against its enemies. They remembered the June days and thirsted for revenge against the bourgeois order that had massacred their comrades. Underground organizations maintained networks across Paris and provincial France, preparing for the day when they would rise again to establish a truly democratic and egalitarian society. The bourgeoisie, traumatized by the June uprising and terrified of socialism, increasingly prioritized order over liberty. Many wealthy Parisians had fled the city during the 1848 troubles and returned determined to prevent any recurrence. They supported strong government, expanded police powers, and restrictions on political participation by the poor. The specter of communism, the redistribution of property, and the leveling of social hierarchies haunted their nightmares. The Catholic Church emerged as a major political force. After decades of tension between church and state dating back to the Revolution, religious conservatives found new influence under the Republic. The Church supported Louis Napoleon, who had courted Catholic support by defending the Pope's temporal power in Rome and promoting religious education. In return, the clergy used their influence to support the president and oppose socialist ideas they considered threats to religion and morality. International events influenced Parisian politics. Across Europe, the revolutionary wave of 1848 had been suppressed, with conservative and reactionary forces reasserting control. Political refugees flooded into Paris, bringing news of failed uprisings and brutal repression. The Hungarian revolutionary Lajos Kossuth, the Italian Republican Giuseppe Mazzini, and numerous other exiles found a sanctuary in Paris, keeping alive dreams of liberal and national revolution, while also serving as reminders of recent failures. Chapter 4: Economic Conditions and Industrial Development. The economy of Paris in 1850 was transitioning from traditional artisanal production to industrial capitalism. Though this transformation was far from complete, the city remained primarily a center of skilled craft production rather than heavy industry, distinguishing it from emerging industrial cities like Manchester or Birmingham in England. Small workshops dominated Parisian manufacturing. A typical workshop might employ a master craftsman, several journeymen, and 1 or 2 apprentices, producing custom goods, clothing, furniture, books, decorative items, for specific clients. These workshops filled courtyards and side streets throughout the city, their operations visible and audible to passers-by. The sound of Paris included the hammering of shoemakers, the clatter of printing presses, the sawing of woodworkers, and the calls of street vendors selling the products of hundreds of small enterprises. Certain industries were concentrating and modernizing. Textile production employed thousands of workers, particularly women, in both workshops and early factories. Ready-made clothing was becoming more common, though custom tailoring remained prestigious. The printing industry was expanding rapidly, producing newspapers, books, and commercial materials. Metalworking and machine construction were growing fields as Paris industrialized. Railroad construction was transforming the French economy and society. By 1850, several railway lines connected Paris to provincial cities, bringing raw materials to the capital and allowing Parisian goods to reach distant markets. The great railway stations, the Gare du Nord, Gare de l'Est, and others, were under construction or recently completed, their iron and glass architecture representing modernity and progress. Railways required enormous capital investment, creating opportunities for financiers and bankers, while also generating demand for iron, coal, and engineering expertise. Banking and finance were becoming increasingly important to the Parisian economy. The city was France's financial capital, home to the Bank of France, numerous private banks, and a stock exchange where shares in railway companies and industrial enterprises traded actively. The Rothschild family and other banking dynasties wielded enormous influence, financing government loans, railway construction, and industrial development. The growth of finance created new forms of wealth and power, elevating financiers to the top of the social hierarchy. Retail commerce was evolving. Traditional small shops lined the ground floors of buildings throughout the city, each specializing in specific goods: bread, wine, meat, candles, fabric. Shopkeepers knew their customers personally and extended credit to regular patrons. However, new forms of retail were emerging. The Bon Marché, which would become Paris's first true department store, was founded in 1852, but similar innovations were already appearing in 1850. Large shops offering multiple product categories, fixed prices, and the ability to browse without obligation were beginning to change how Parisians shopped. Les Halles, the central market, formed the commercial heart of Paris. This vast complex of buildings and open-air stalls supplied the city with food. Farmers and merchants arrived before dawn to sell produce, meat, fish, and other provisions to retailers and consumers. The market operated with extraordinary efficiency, despite its apparent chaos, moving enormous quantities of perishable goods through the city each day. The smells, sounds, and crowds of Les Halles were legendary. Observers described it as both magnificent and disgusting. a symbol of Paris's abundance and vitality. Working conditions varied widely, but were generally harsh by modern standards. Skilled craftsmen worked long hours, but maintained some control over their work and took pride in their skill. Factory workers faced regimented schedules, dangerous machinery, and unhealthy environments. Women and children received lower wages than men for similar work. Workplace accidents were common, and workers had no legal protections or insurance against injury, unemployment, or old age. Wages reflected skill levels and gender. A skilled craftsman might earn 4 to 6 francs per day, enough to support a family modestly if work was steady. Unskilled male laborers earned 2 to 3 francs daily. Women typically earned half what men earned for similar work. Domestic servants received room and board plus a small wage, perhaps 200 to 300 francs annually. These wages had to cover rent, food, fuel, and clothing, leaving little surplus for most workers. The cost of living pressed heavily on working families. Rent consumed a large portion of income. A working-class family might pay 150 to 250 francs annually for a single room or small apartment. Bread, the dietary staple, cost about 30 centimes for a 4-pound loaf. Meat, vegetables, coal for heating, and other necessities added up quickly. Economic insecurity was constant. Illness, unemployment, or injury could immediately reduce a family to destitution. Middle-class and wealthy Parisians enjoyed comfortable or luxurious lifestyles. A bourgeois professional or businessman might earn 3,000 to 10,000 francs annually, affording a spacious apartment, servants, fine food, and cultural entertainments. The wealthy elite, bankers, major industrialists, successful speculators, possessed fortunes in the hundreds of thousands or millions of francs, living in opulent private mansions with large staffs of servants. Economic inequality was stark and visible. Wealthy and poor lived in close proximity, but occupied different worlds. A bourgeois woman in an expensive silk gown might pass a ragged beggar on the same street. Luxurious shops displaying expensive goods stood near hovels where families lived in single rooms. This proximity created social tensions. The poor could see wealth they could never attain, while the wealthy could not ignore the poverty surrounding them. Chapter 5: Culture, Arts, and Intellectual Life. Paris in 1850 was indisputably the cultural capital of Europe, a city where art, literature, music, and ideas flourished despite political turmoil and economic hardship. The cultural life of the city was extraordinarily rich and diverse, ranging from elite salons and official institutions to bohemian cafes and popular entertainments. The literary scene was vibrant and contentious. Victor Hugo, already famous for Notre Dame de Paris and other works, was living in exile after opposing Louis Napoleon. But his influence remained powerful. Honoré de Balzac had recently died after completing much of his vast human comedy, a series of novels that portrayed French society in exhaustive detail. George Sand, the pseudonymous female novelist, continued producing works that combined romanticism with social commentary. These established writers coexisted with younger authors like Charles Baudelaire, who was developing the poetry that would revolutionize French literature. Newspapers and journals were crucial to Parisian intellectual life. Despite censorship and government restrictions, numerous publications offered news, commentary, fiction, and criticism. Le Siècle, La Presse, and other major dailies reached thousands of readers. Literary journals published serialized novels. Alexandre Dumas and Eugene Sue wrote popular adventure and melodramatic fiction that appeared in installments, keeping readers eagerly awaiting the next episode. Political journals debated the issues of the day, often using allegory and allusion to evade censors. Cafés served as centers of intellectual and artistic life. The Café de Flore, Café de la Régence, and dozens of other establishments provided spaces where writers, artists, students, and political activists gathered to talk, read newspapers, and debate ideas. A cup of coffee purchased the right to sit for hours, making cafés affordable social spaces for struggling artists and students. Specific cafés became associated with particular groups. Realist painters gathered in one location, Republican journalists in another, socialist workers in a third. The bohemian lifestyle was emerging as a distinct cultural phenomenon. Young artists, writers, and musicians rejected bourgeois values and conventional careers, choosing poverty and freedom over security and respectability. They lived in cheap garrets in the Latin Quarter, wore eccentric clothing, kept irregular hours, and scandalized respectable society with their unconventional relationships and ideas. This bohemian culture, immortalized in Henri Murger's Scènes de la vie de Bohème, represented both romantic rebellion and genuine artistic innovation. Visual arts were in transition. The official salon, the annual exhibition sponsored by the Academy of Fine Arts, remained the primary venue for artists to display their work and establish their reputations. Academic painting dominated. Historical scenes, mythological subjects, portraits, all executed in technically polished styles that followed classical conventions. However, younger artists were rebelling against these traditions. Gustave Courbet was developing realism, painting ordinary people and scenes from everyday life with unflinching honesty that shocked critics accustomed to idealized subjects. Music occupied an important place in Parisian culture. The opera was a social institution where the wealthy displayed themselves as much as they listened to music. Performances of works by established composers like Rossini or Meyerbeer were major social events. Smaller theaters offered lighter entertainments, operettas, vaudevilles, and popular songs. Concert halls presented instrumental music, though Paris was less important as a center for instrumental music than Vienna or Leipzig. Popular music flourished in cafes and dance halls, where working-class Parisians enjoyed themselves with songs, dancing, and drinking. The theater thrived in multiple forms. Classical French drama continued at the Comédie Française, where actors performed works by Molière, Racine, and Corneille for educated audiences. Boulevard theaters offered popular melodramas, comedies, and spectacular productions with elaborate sets and special effects. These theaters attracted diverse audiences, from workers in the cheap seats to bourgeois families in boxes. Plays provided entertainment, but also commentary on contemporary society, often using historical settings to discuss current issues. Education and intellectual institutions shaped cultural life. The Sorbonne and other schools trained the next generation of scholars and professionals. The Collège de France offered public lectures by leading intellectuals. The Academy of Sciences, the Academy of Fine Arts, and other learned societies provided forums for presenting research and ideas. Libraries, though limited in number and accessibility, preserved knowledge and served scholars. Scientific and technological progress was accelerating. French scientists made significant contributions to chemistry, physics, and medicine. Louis Pasteur was beginning his career and would soon make groundbreaking discoveries about microbiology. Technological innovations, railways, telegraphs, photography, improved industrial machinery were changing daily life and creating new possibilities. However, these advances also generated anxiety about social change and the displacement of traditional ways of life. Photography was new and revolutionary. Daguerreotypes, the first practical photographic process, had been invented in Paris in 1839, and by 1850, photography was becoming more common. Portrait studios opened across the city, allowing middle-class Parisians to preserve their images. Photographers also documented the city's streets and monuments, creating visual records of a Paris that would soon be transformed. Photography's relationship to art was controversial. Some saw it as a mechanical process that could never equal painting, while others recognized its artistic potential. Popular culture existed alongside elite arts. Street performers, acrobats, singers, puppet shows entertained crowds. Itinerant musicians played on corners. Spectacles like circuses and menageries attracted curious crowds. Cheap books and illustrated prints brought stories and images to the semi-literate. This popular culture was vibrant and creative, though elite observers often dismissed it as vulgar or degraded. Chapter 6: Public Health, Sanitation, and Urban Challenges. Paris in 1850 was a profoundly unhealthy city where disease, filth, and environmental hazards claimed thousands of lives annually. The urban infrastructure inherited from medieval times could not support a population approaching 1 million people, creating public health crises that afflicted residents of all social classes, though the poor suffered disproportionately. Water supply was inadequate and contaminated. Most Parisians obtained water from public fountains, the Seine River, or private wells, all of dubious quality. Water carriers transported water in buckets to apartments, climbing 5 or 6 flights of stairs multiple times daily, a grueling occupation that employed thousands. The wealthy might have water delivered and stored in cisterns, but even they could not guarantee its purity. The Seine, which supplied much of the city's water, also received sewage and industrial waste, creating a deadly cycle of contamination. Sewage disposal was primitive and horrifying. Most buildings had no connection to sewers. Instead, residents used chamber pots, or primitive toilets that emptied into cesspools beneath buildings. These cesspools were supposed to be emptied periodically by night soil workers, who carted the waste to dumps outside the city, but in practice, they often overflowed or leaked into groundwater, contaminating wells and basements. The smell in many neighborhoods was overpowering, especially in summer. The few sewers that existed were medieval in design, narrow channels that often clogged, creating stagnant pools of filth. These sewers were open ditches in some areas, covered by removable stones that allowed noxious gases to escape into streets. The sewer system was completely inadequate for the city's size, and major expansion would not occur until the Haussmann renovations of the following decades. Streets were repositories for garbage, animal waste, and liquid filth. Residents threw refuse out windows into the streets below, where it accumulated until rain washed it into gutters or scavengers. Human and animal removed it. Horse droppings covered pavements, and dead animals lay in streets until removed. Butchers and fishmongers disposed of offal in streets near their shops. The stench must have been overwhelming, though residents presumably became somewhat accustomed to it. Disease was endemic and epidemic. Cholera had struck Paris in devastating epidemics in 1832 and 1849, killing thousands. The disease, caused by contaminated water, spread rapidly through the densely packed working-class neighborhoods where sanitation was worst. Tuberculosis, then called consumption, was the leading cause of death, claiming victims across all social classes, but especially prevalent in crowded, poorly ventilated housing. Typhoid fever, typhus, smallpox, and other infectious diseases were constant threats. Infant and child mortality rates were appalling. Approximately 1/4 of infants died before their first birthday, and many more died in early childhood. Diarrheal diseases, respiratory infections, and malnutrition claimed these young victims. Working-class mothers often had to return to work shortly after giving birth, leaving infants with inadequate care. Wet nurses, hired to breastfeed bourgeois infants, often lived in unsanitary conditions that endangered their charges. Medical care was limited and often ineffective. Physicians existed, but served primarily the wealthy. Their knowledge, though advancing, remained incomplete. They did not understand germ theory, had limited diagnostic capabilities, and possessed few effective treatments. Surgery was performed without anesthesia or antiseptic procedures, making it agonizingly painful and frequently fatal due to infection. Hospitals existed, but were places of last resort, overcrowded institutions where patients often died from infections contracted there. Air quality was terrible. Thousands of coal fires heated homes and powered workshops, blanketing the city in smoke and soot. Buildings and laundry turned black from airborne particles. Respiratory diseases flourished in this polluted atmosphere. Industrial activities, metalworking, chemical production, tanning, released toxic fumes into the air. There were no regulations limiting pollution or protecting workers from hazardous substances. Overcrowding created impossible living conditions for the poor. Entire families lived in single rooms, measuring perhaps 12 by 15 feet, often sharing these spaces with boarders. Rooms lacked heat, light, and ventilation. Dampness caused by poor construction and lack of maintenance contributed to respiratory illness. Vermin, rats, bedbugs, lice, fleas infested buildings. Privacy was non-existent, with profound psychological and moral consequences that middle-class observers found deeply disturbing. Food safety was completely unregulated. Milk was often watered down or contaminated. Meat and fish spoiled quickly without refrigeration, and cellars disguised spoilage with spices or chemicals. Bread was sometimes adulterated with cheaper ingredients. Wine was frequently diluted or doctored. The poor, unable to afford quality food and lacking knowledge to detect fraud, suffered most from consuming adulterated or spoiled provisions. Occupational hazards killed and injured thousands. Construction workers fell from scaffolding. Factory workers lost fingers or limbs to unguarded machinery. Miners and tunnelers died in collapses. Workers in chemical industries suffered poisoning. There were no safety regulations, no workers' compensation, no disability insurance. An injured worker and his family faced destitution. Life expectancy reflected these harsh conditions. Average life expectancy at birth was perhaps 35 to 40 years, though this statistic was heavily influenced by high infant and child mortality. Those who survived childhood might live to 60 or beyond, but many working-class adults died in their 40s or 50s, worn out by labor and privation. The contrast between classes was stark. Wealthy Parisians lived significantly longer than the poor, benefiting from better nutrition, housing, and medical care. Some reformers recognized these problems and advocated for improvements. Public health advocates called for better water supplies, sewers, housing standards, and urban planning. However, implementation faced enormous obstacles. The cost of infrastructure improvements, resistance from property owners, lack of governmental capacity, and limited scientific understanding of disease transmission all impeded reform. Significant improvements would not occur until Baron Haussmann's transformation of Paris began in the late 1850s. Chapter 7: Glimpses of the Future. Paris in 1850 stood at a threshold, a city about to undergo transformation so radical that within 2 decades it would be almost unrecognizable. The medieval city of narrow streets, crowded slums, and pre-modern infrastructure would give way to the grand boulevards, public parks, monuments, and modern systems that define Paris today. These changes were already beginning, visible in small ways to those who looked carefully. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte was the agent of this coming transformation. His experiences in England had exposed him to modern urban planning and infrastructure. He admired London's parks and water systems. He understood that Paris's medieval layout made it both unhealthy and difficult to control politically. Narrow streets facilitated barricade construction during uprisings. He dreamed of remaking Paris into a modern capital worthy of a new French empire. The coup d'état came in December 1851. Louis Napoleon, barred by the Constitution from seeking re-election, simply seized power. He arrested opponents, suppressed resistance with military force, and declared himself Emperor Napoleon III. The Second Republic ended, replaced by the Second Empire. This authoritarian regime would govern France for nearly 2 decades, presiding over economic growth, imperial expansion, and the radical reconstruction of Paris. Baron Georges Eugene Haussmann became prefect of the Seine in 1853 and immediately began implementing Napoleon III's vision for Paris. Over the next 17 years, Haussmann directed the most extensive urban renewal project ever attempted. His workers demolished thousands of buildings, displacing hundreds of thousands of residents. They cut broad boulevards through the urban fabric, creating the network of grand avenues we know today. They built parks, squares, sewers, water systems, and public monuments on an unprecedented scale. This transformation had profound consequences. The new boulevards were beautiful, but also strategic, wide enough that troops could march along them and artillery could fire down them, making barricades ineffective. Working-class neighborhoods in central Paris were destroyed, their residents pushed to peripheral districts or suburbs. Rents increased as new buildings targeted middle-class and wealthy tenants. Paris became more segregated, with the poor concentrated in specific areas rather than mixed throughout the city. Infrastructure improvements brought genuine benefits. A modern sewer system dramatically improved public health. Aqueducts brought clean water from distant sources. Gas lighting illuminated streets at night, improving safety. Parks and green spaces provided recreation and fresh air. The Paris we recognize today, the grand boulevards, the opera, the monumental public buildings, emerged from this transformation. The cultural life that flourished in 1850 continued evolving. The Impressionist painters who would revolutionize art were children or young adults in 1850. Claude Monet was 10 years old, Pierre-Auguste Renoir was 9. They would grow up in the changing city and develop artistic techniques to capture its light, movement, and modern character. Writers like Émile Zola would document both the splendor and the squalor of the new Paris in novels that combined social criticism with naturalistic observation. The economic trends visible in 1850 accelerated. Industrialization progressed, though Paris never became primarily a heavy industrial city like those in northern France or Germany. Banking and finance grew enormously in importance, transforming Paris into a center of international capitalism. Department stores revolutionized retail, creating new forms of consumption and commercial culture. Railways expanded, connecting Paris to all of France and to the rest of Europe. Politically, the authoritarianism of the Second Empire eventually provoked opposition. The regime liberalized somewhat in the 1860s, permitting more press freedom and political organizing. However, Napoleon III's foreign adventures, particularly the disastrous war with Prussia in 1870, led to military defeat, the emperor's capture, and the empire's collapse. The Paris Commune of 1871, a revolutionary government that briefly controlled the city, represented the workers' movement that had been building since 1848. Its violent suppression demonstrated that the social conflicts of 1850 remained unresolved. The Paris of 1850 was a city of extraordinary contrasts, beauty and squalor, wealth and poverty, cultural brilliance, and social misery. It was a city still recognizably medieval in its physical form, yet already experiencing the social and economic forces of modernity. It was a city where revolutionary traditions remained alive, where workers dreamed of social justice, where artists created lasting works of beauty, where daily life was harsh for most, yet full of vitality and possibility. Understanding this, Paris requires seeing beyond romantic images to recognize the hard realities of life for ordinary people. It means acknowledging the diseases, filth, and inequality, while also appreciating the genuine accomplishments in art, literature, and thought. It means recognizing that the beautiful city we admire today was built, in part, by destroying the vibrant, if chaotic city that existed in 1850, displacing communities, and erasing neighborhoods in the name of progress and order. The transformation of Paris from its 1850 condition to the modern city we know today offers lessons about urban development, social change, and the costs and benefits of modernization. It reminds us that cities are not static monuments, but living organisms that evolve, that change brings both gains and losses, and that the apparently inevitable march of progress involves choices that benefit some while harming others. The Paris of 1850, in all its complexity and contradiction, represents a crucial moment in this ongoing story of urban and social transformation.